Raoul Hilberg began his work, it was, of course, still very early after the war as a student. In fact, when he told his own dissertation supervisor that he wanted to work in this area, his advisor said, well, that's your funeral. So when Raoul Hilberg presented this 850-page book, it was much longer than most publishers want to publish on any topic, and here it's on a topic they don't even think is legitimate. So I think most of them just said this would cost a whole lot to publish, no one is interested, it has no function, and so they just turned it down. That it was finally published for the first time in 1961. But it was hardly reviewed. It was not understood to be a major work really until I think the early 1970s. So it was a book slow in getting published, and then slow in getting read, and then slow in getting accepted and recognized as a monumental work of scholarship. The sorting out of the final solution as being a particular form of Nazi persecution and extermination that had a greater priority and a greater intensity and a separate kind of program behind it, we did not become fully aware of course, until some of the books were written. And Hilberg's is the one that defined that most clearly. They're not quite sure of is the local populations. And they initially hoped that they would stir up pogroms, and they certainly had orders to do that. And in some places, they're successful in a brief period. In some places, they're not. And what they increasingly find is that it is more productive, more organized, more controllable if, instead of simply stirring up pogroms, they recruit local people into a controlled auxiliary police. And some people come to volunteer to the Germans very early. Himmler gives the order to organize these auxiliary police formations directly under and trained by the German Order Police. And there are going to be 30,000 of these people recruited by December, 300,000 by the end of 1942. Most of the trigger pullers, most of the people doing the actual shooting in the second wave in 1942 are not Germans. They are going to be the auxiliary police that are recruited. In some areas, like Lithuania and Latvia, they are already the major killers in the late summer and fall of 1941. So the Nazis discover the army is going to be cooperative. They discover that they can enlist and recruit and use local populations to do part of this. And so that's crucial for the manpower. Remember, the Einsatzgruppen are 3,000 men. And if you stretch the Einsatzgruppen from the Black Sea to the Baltic Sea, 3,000 men is not going to be able to kill very many people. And even if in late July you throw in a dozen police battalions and 2 SS brigades, you bring the number of killers up to about 20,000 operating behind the lines. Even that is not going to be enough. And so it is the bringing in the native auxiliary police that really gives the massive manpower. The Jews visually are seen as the ones who had the least objection to the Red Army coming in. And of course, in 1939, if you were a Jew in Latvia or in Eastern Poland, and your choice was the Nazis coming all the way, or the Nazis stopping at the demarcation line and the Red Army coming in from the other side, you're very grateful that the Red Army came instead. The Red Army isn't out to kill Jews. The Nazi army is. So of course the Jews in these areas greeted the Red Army as protectors. For the native populations, Ukrainians and Lithuanians, this is viewed as treason. This is viewed as greeting the foreign conqueror and confirming the Jews are all communists. So when the Nazis come and say we're out to get rid of Jews and Bolsheviks, this makes perfect sense in the mind of the locals who have experienced the last 2 years as a Bolshevik regime supported and welcomed by the Jews. And you have this explosion of resentment and frustration and rage that the Nazis stir up and approve and allow and give permission to, and then actually organize and institutionalize. After the war, of course, everybody said, we didn't know. Well, that certainly did not mean all of the pre-war persecution, because that's laws that are made public. It certainly didn't mean Kristallnacht, because you're destroying synagogues and destroying stores in the middle of every city in Germany. Everybody knows. Once the war begins, the center of persecution, of course, shifts from Germany to the occupied territories. But you still have many German soldiers, many German occupiers that are going to witness what is going on. And I think it is fairly clear that enough people saw these different massacres and they went back on leave and they talked. They took pictures because we have repeated orders by the SS and the army, don't take pictures, because they kept doing it. The Germans traveled with cameras in their backpacks. They would come to witness these executions. There would be tourism at the executions, at the big ones. This was sensational. People would gather and watch. And so then they would go home and they would talk mouth to mouth. This would be hearsay relaying. And then, of course, that became a rumor that would be relayed on. The soldier sees a fragment of it. He tells someone else who tells someone else, which of course makes it hearsay about a fragment. And the question is, when did people get enough fragments to put it together, to connect, have enough dots they could connect the dots and understand what was going on? That basically depended upon whether you wanted to collect information, whether you wanted to process the information you have to understand what was happening. Most people didn't want to. The people that wanted to know had no trouble putting it all together. Some letters we have are very, very blunt. I came across a letter in the archives it was an excerpt from an American censor after the war who is reading German mail. And this was a letter from a German who had been stationed in Norway. This is way far away from where the executions are happening. He's stationed in Norway and he's writing to a friend in Uruguay. And the Americans are checking the mail. And basically he makes a copy of the letter. And the man says, I was in Norway, but as early as January 1942, I heard from sailors whose ships had been in the Baltic, came to Norway, about about massacres on the Eastern Front. One of them has seen where 75,000 people, this is an exaggerated number, but it shows that he knew the magnitude, were killed in 3 days. By 1944, we knew from Swiss reports out of Switzerland about gassing. By 1944, we knew everything. And then he goes on to say, and now in Nuremberg, the bigwigs say they knew nothing at all. It is really laughable, is what he writes. So he knew exactly when he had learned about the shooting. He knew when he had learned about the gassing. And he considered people who were denying this to be totally ridiculous. But he wanted to know. Some people didn't want to know, and when you don't want to know, you can generally shut the information out. Information about the death camps is much harder to get. One of the reasons why you go from mass killing by shooting to death camps is, of course, it can be much more private. Treblinka, Sobibor, or Belzec are tiny little places in the countryside in Poland, and they're far away from anything else, and they're basically out of sight. So that rumors spread in Germany about gassing, but they are much less specific, because they can't imagine how the gassing is done. They can't imagine a factory designed to kill people in an industrial assembly line process, which a death camp is. They've heard rumors of the gassing, but they can't picture it. They can't understand how it is actually done. This is because of the Himmler visit to Auschwitz and his becoming too talkative at the social event where other people are present. And that's how, in fact, the word gets out that's the origin of the Riegner telegram. He came to Auschwitz in the summer of 1942, witnessed the killing, the gassing of Dutch Jews, and it is thereafter that he then gives the approval to build the modern gas chamber complexes, the bunker, the crematoria, the combination gas chamber crematoria that are in operation by the spring of 1943. It's during that visit that apparently he was having a social entertainment, that the Silesian industrialist is present, hears what they're talking about, goes to Switzerland, and that's the origin of the Riegner telegram. It's right after that the Riegner informs the man working with the Jewish Relief Agency, tells the American consulate in Geneva that he has reliable information from his contact, who has always been accurate in the past, that now at the center at Hitler headquarters, they've decided to kill all the Jews of Europe. They'll do it with what he calls prussic acid. It means they're going to use Cyclone B. That he, this information has come out of Germany. Himmler in 1943 basically wants to get rid of all Jewish workers, particularly after the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. He not only thinks that Germans who are using Jewish labor are becoming contaminated by the spirit of materialism, that is, they are being seduced by the wealth that they are gaining and thus becoming too pro-Jewish, not fanatical enough. And he also sees that the Jews are the source, in his mind, of unrest, insecurity behind the lines. So in the summer of 1942, you have this operation that liquidates most all the labor camps in Ostgalician, East Galicia, and you liquidate the Białystok ghetto. And then in the fall, you have this horrific massacre in which you liquidate almost all the labor camps in the Lublin district in 2 days. This is the Erntefest massacre, November 3 to 4, 1943. 43,000 people killed in 2 days. This is the biggest single killing operation of the entire war, in which all the Jewish workers, with just 2 exceptions, are liquidated. The last labor camp outside of Lvov, Janowska Road, is liquidated at this time. And the Riga ghetto and others, they are ended, and people are transferred scattered to some few camps that are still left. So Himmler is very anxious to end using all Jewish labor. But beyond Lublin, the further west you go, the further behind the lines, the less he can make a security argument. And the further you get behind the lines, the more you have a sophisticated industry that's crucial to the war effort. So that the Radom district camps survive, the western camps of the Krakow district, Płaszów, survives, the Silesian camps and the Auschwitz complex survive, and the Lodz ghetto survives. Those are the 4 major areas of the Polish Jews that are in slave labor. After the war, the Allies went after the most prominent Nazi leaders for the international trial. And then, at least in the American zone, to some extent in the British zone, also in the Soviet zone, there were low-level trials of concentration camp personnel above all, because there wasn't going to be a second international military tribunal. Things between the Soviets and the Allies were becoming tense already. The Americans conducted a second series of trials called the American Military Tribunals, and they had the trials of the top people in the justice, the top people in the foreign office, the top people in the Einsatz, this is the Einsatzgruppen trial, the top people involved in ethnic cleansing, the resettlement office, some of the top industrialists, the Flick concern, Krupp. There were 12 of these trials that were trying to show, in a sense, how pervasive the Nazi system was and how out of so many different areas of the professions people came. There was a doctor's trial, the chief doctors for euthanasia. But that was not followed up, because by then the Cold War is setting in. The Americans are setting up the Federal Republic and are turning power over to Adenauer. There's immense pressure to commute those sentences and to let those people go. Your sentences are rapidly reduced in the early 50s, and everybody convicted of those trials is free by 1958. There's nobody convicted by the Americans that is still sitting in prison for being a mass murderer after 1958. And Adenauer was pressuring the Americans to let these people go, and certainly was not eager to launch German trials in his own right. So in the 1950s, American sentences are being reduced, people convicted by the Americans are being freed, and the Germans are damping down, lowering the number of trials they're holding. By the late 50s, something very strange happens. Germans begin to feel differently. You're beginning to get a different generation. And 1958 is, in a sense, the key turning point. What happened, and this is the rare case, is that the prosecutor in Ulm decided, instead of limiting it to the one person who he had to do, decided instead of doing the minimum, he would do the maximum. And so this grew up into the famous Ulm trial of the Tilsit Commando. 10 people indicted, 10 people convicted, and in fact, a revelation because of the extent of the research they had done of absolutely how pervasive the participation of different kinds of units, not just the Einsatzgruppen, but of all sorts of people was in killing in the German East. It was that trial that gave the leverage to suggest we need a central agency to coordinate investigation. Creating the central agency meant you created an agency to go look. And the way in which they looked was to create crime complexes. That is, they would divide up Europe, and particularly the East. The four Einsatzgruppen, East was assigned an investigative team. All the police headquarters were assigned investigative teams. All the major concentration camps are assigned teams. That process is invented after 1958, and that's what leads very quickly to the great Auschwitz trial in Frankfurt in 1962-63, then on to the trials of Treblinka and other things, and creates this big wave of trials in Germany in the 1960s, which is Adenauer had never envisaged, never dreamed of. He thought he had put all this behind him. But it really is a younger generation of Germans that basically says, we are going to deal with this. And it's a small group of very courageous lawyers and investigators that, without much popular support, carry out what becomes an absolutely crucial investigation of the whole breadth of Nazi criminality. They have almost no luck trying to charge anyone in the army, anybody who's in industry, and unless they have signed an absolutely incriminating order, anybody who's just in the bureaucracy. So it becomes mainly a trial of the SS in the various places they had been in Europe. And unless the evidence is so overwhelming, nobody else gets dragged in.